I thought it'd be good just to. But Midbar is so interesting, right? There's so much going on in the Sefer, and if you look at the Netziv's introduction to Sefer Bamidbar, um, he has a very interesting um, analysis as to what's really going on. What's the sort of the plot line as it as it evolves within Sefer Bamidbar. So let's just jump into what he how he describes this, and it actually we'll see it's a lot of this is actually comes up. A lot of his points actually come up in this week's parsha, so it's good timing here. So he starts by saying, "Zeh Sefer Nikra B'fiatana Rav Hanani ben Gamliel in Gemara Sota Chumash HaPekudim." Right. This is clearly, I guess, how the non-Jewish world came to refer to this as numbers, but Chazal also call it Chumash HaPekudim. Right. This is the fifth. This is the book of the countings, the enumerations. V'chein Kasu Bahag, and the Bahag also refers to it in that way. And it seems like, and he says that, why is that? Because we do have two separate countings that go on in across Sefer Bamidbar. We have the one that's right at the beginning, right? We saw it, and right in the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, we start out with, and Parshas Bamidbar, we start out with the counting. And then we have a second counting in Parshas Pinchas, right after the Magefa, the whole issue with Bilam, the Midyanim, the women of Midyan, and then the Magefa within Bnei Israel, and then there's a second counting.
Jeff, there were actually two countings in Parshat Bamidbar. They were the same number, and they were right after each other, but there were two separate countings.
Right. You mean like that we're counting the Levium separately from, like, you're right. We spent a lot of time in Parshas Bamidbar with all the, for sure.
No, they went up where they camped. Some were north, some were east, south, and west.
Absolutely. And it's perfect that you're bringing that up, because that's actually going to be one of the points that the Netziv gets to in a moment. So we'll circle back to that. But that's a great insight as well.
Jeff, what is Pekudim exactly? It's counting, it's numbers. What is Pekudim?
Right. So Pekudim can mean two different things. It can mean to a point, but can also mean to count. And we see in just like how Unclus translates it across the Psukim, that sometimes it seems to indicate that you are appointing somebody, but in general here what we're talking about is the fact that they're counted.
Perfect. Thanks.
But the Netziv asks a question first. He says, but wait a second. Yosef Mishar Devarim Shemiyuchadim B'zeh HaSefer Kamo HaMeraglim Birchas Bilam Vod Harbe. So why is that? Why are we calling this the book of enumerations of numbers? Like, really, when you look at Sefer Bamidbar, there's so much going on between the story of the spies, the story of Bilam, Midyan. There's so much going on. We have the wars going on at the end. Why specifically numbers? Why is that what Chazal focused in on? He says, "Mishum de'ikra hasefer hu machlif u'mishana halichos am Hashem b'chayi olam me'az shegir l'Eretz Yisrael." And he says that it's because the numbers are, well, we haven't got there yet, but he says that really the ikr of the Sefer is this transition. We are transitioning from being wandering in the Midbar to going into Eretz Yisrael. That's really what's going on in Sefer Bamidbar. It says, "Mina derech sheholchu Bamidbar, shebamidbar hayu misnagim b'midas tifera sheholech liyamin Moshe, shu legamri lamala melichos hateva." He says, when we're in the Midbar, everything is lamala min hateva, right? We are in the glory of Hashem's presence on the right of Moshe. The Yamin Moshe, I think that's a quote from Yirmiyahu. But either way, it's clearly it's the life that we had in the Midbar was not a normal sort of olam hazeh type of existence that we know of today. But once we get into Eretz Yisrael, that lifestyle changes, and now we're in a world of nature. And it's and the Hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, excuse me, becomes much more hidden, right? It becomes much more difficult to see sometimes the Hashgacha, which we saw very clearly in the Midbar. So he says, but he says that transition actually started in the 40th year. And he says we actually start to see this in Parshas Chukas. That is in the 40th year. That's when those events took place. And when we took a look at the wars, that when we fought the Kanani and Sichon, all of that was b'derech hateva, right? There wasn't the Makos, right? There wasn't Kriyas Yamsuf. There wasn't all that happened when we were leaving Mitzrayim. V'gam hamata lo haya od biad Moshe tamid el leisat tzorech lefi ha'echrech k'moshe bi'arnu sham. So let me just jump down. I've got a few, and he says that also the staff of Moshe's staff, is no longer in his hands at all times, like it was previously. So let me just jump down. So this is in Parshas Chukas. It says, "Vayevom bnei Yisrael kol ha'edom midbar tzin b'chodesh harishon." In the first month, they came to midbar tzin. They sat and they were in. They dwelled. They were in Kadesh. And that's where Miriam dies, and that's where she was buried. And the Emek Dever says, Shoshnas Arabayim. What does it mean? It just says the first month, Nisan, but it doesn't say what year. And this is where the Netziv is saying Shoshnas Arabayim. So this is the 40th year. So this is, again, this is his Mahalik, and he says Kamesha Kasav Haravah. So this is also the Ibn Ezra, who he's quoting from, that said this is the 40th year. Now, by the Mate, it's, so this is also in Parshas Chukas, right? This is where Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, take the Mate and hit the rock, or I'm sorry, and talk to the rock, right? Don't hit the rock, talk to the rock, right? And have it, water should come forth. So what does it mean? Kachas Hamate, and the Emek Dever, and the Netziv says, Hamate Hayadua, right? We know which Mate we're talking about, right? This is the Mate Yadua Shal Moshe. It wasn't always in his hand because he's no longer doing miracles on a daily basis. That wasn't, this is the 40th year. We're now transitioning. So this is the whole mahalech, that the whole transition that the Netziv is pointing out. So you can even see it. He continues it with his perush. Okay. All right. Let's jump back up. Okay. Should be okay. So the Medrash says on the pasuk in Bereshis, when Hashem separates between light and darkness, Zeh Sefer Bamidbar, which is an interesting, what does that mean exactly? So the Netziv says, Shehu Mavdo ben Yotzi Mitzrayim uvin Bai Haaretz. That's the transition. That's the transition that the Netziv was describing earlier, where we're moving from a time period when we see the Hashgacha of Hashem very clearly in front of us. Things are happening very quickly. As soon as we do something right or wrong, punishment may come, or we understand it right away from the word of Moshe, to a time where it's not so clear, and that's when we go into Eretz Yisrael. That's choshech meaning that the hashgacha of Hashem is a bit more hidden from us. We don't see it as clearly. We don't know right away if we've done something improper. And now he's getting back to that point. So what does this have to do with numbers? So it's a whole thing as a transition. Out of the enumerations, the counting of Bnei Yisrael, how does that come in? And he says it's actually very clear. He says you can see it in the two different times that were counted. And in the way that they're counted seems operationally, the way that they counted seems very much the same. But when we take a look at the result of it, or how it sort of comes out, we can see the change. And Rick, this is, I think, to your point, and that's what he's pointing out, is that in the first counting, it was a counting, but then we talked, then the psukim go into how the count goes into where everybody is stationed, right? The 4 different directions, and which 3 shavatim are on each of the different sides, and what their count is within those 3 groupings. The group of 3 within the 4, 4 directions. And that's how they travel. And he says that the way they travel that way as well, across the 4 directions, is like the Merkava Shechina. So, it's all indicative again of this idea that we are so connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu this time, but it's all about how we're traveling together in this formation. V'haya, and in that counting, or as it's being described in Parshas Bamidbar, it says V'haya Ephraim Rosha Degav Akodem LaMenashe. And if you look at it, Ephraim is mentioned first. When they talk about the Degel Ephraim, he's mentioned before Menashe, even though Menashe is, right, Menashe is actually the Bechor, but he's mentioned, but Ephraim is mentioned first. But it says V'lo came b'pekudei Parshas Pinchas Bishnas Arbaim. But if you go to Parshas Pinchas and you look at how they're mentioned over there, Menashe is mentioned first, because it's transitioning over from again, this idea of what's going on in the Midbar to Menashe being the Bechor, meaning that he, that what he inherits in terms of land in Eretz Yisrael is going to be more than Ephraim, and so he's mentioned first there. Commercial Kasad Bifnim Beis Chof. V'od bepekudei Parshas Bamidbar Hayu Harashim Uchrachim Lios Me'os Hashem V'lo Kein Haya bepekudei Parshas Pinchas Commercial Kasad Bifnim Aleph Mikra Beis. Shumachi Rishum Zeh Hainin Ma'od Achero Chazal Likro Shem La Sefer Chumash Pekudim. So it says that if you just take a look at the way that the 2 enumerations happen, you can see very clearly a split, a designation between the 2, and that is indicative of this whole transformation of Bnei Israel, and that's why they call it Chumash Pekudim. Let's just take a quick look at those. So in the beginning in Parshas Bamidbar, it says Seuas Rosh Kodas Bnei Yisrael Mishpachosam Levis Avosam B'Mispar Shemos Kol Zachor Legulosam Miben Hashem Shalom B'Malako Yitzitzav B'Yisrael Difkedu Osam. And later on it says the language is just a little bit different. Seuas Rosh Kodas Bnei Yisrael Miben Hashem Shalom B'Malako Levis Avosam. So here it's not called Yitzitzav B'Yisrael. Here it's Levis Avosam. So the Netziv is sort of splitting hairs a little bit, but I think what he's doing is he's being very medactic in the language, that we see that there are subtle differences in how the counting actually occurs between Parshas Bamidbar and later on in Parshas Pinchas. Okay. Okay, and then he finishes up. V'anir da pi zeh hakavana amru Chazal devayihi ben soah ha'aron hu sefer bifnei atzmo. So there's an interesting Gemara. This is, and this I think shows up in this week's parsha, right? Parshas Baloscha, I think. The Gemara in Shabbos says, Tanur Rabbanan, Vahi ben soah ha'aron vayoma Moshe parsha zu asa la HaKadosh Baruch Hu simanios milamala ulamata. Right? If you see this in these 2 psukim in a Sefer Torah, you have this sort of upside down nun that separates Vahi ben Aaron and Uvenucha Yomar. They're separated from the psukim before and after with these characters. So it's sort of like these 2 psukim sort of float between what else is going on in the parsha at that point. So the Gemara says, it makes note of that and says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made these simanios, these signs, before and after the 2 psukim. Why? Lomar she'ein zeh mekoma, to say that this isn't really its place. Rabbi Omer, lo min Hashem, who's ela mipnei she'asefer choshuvu b'fnei atzmo. So Rabbi says what's really going on is that this is a sefer unto itself. So it's not clear, like, what does that mean? What's going on here with those two psukim? So let's take a look at the Netziv. He says, "V'nir da'apiz kavana amru chazad v'yi ben zor haron hu sefer b'fnei atzma." So what's that coming to teach us? La'amdenu b'asher ki hascholas hashinoi haya min v'yi ha'am k'misonanim v'gomer. Because he says that the difference when we're starting to change and transform into a people going into Eretz Yisrael, that actually happens right after these two psukim. Because right after those two psukim of Vayhi ben Zor Haron, it says Vayhi ha'am k'misonanim. Right, this is where they start to complain. Ki b'shaver yisnagu b'minas tiferes nenshu miyad achar shechatu ki hayatzeh hashgacha ayidei yaminam. He says that in this time when we are in the midbar and we are so closely connected to Hashem, the hashgacha comes and we are punished right away. This becomes very difficult. And this is what causes, he says, this is what causes Bnei Yisrael to want to send the meraglim. Reish Parshas Shlach. And this is what sets in motion the events, as he says, as I'll describe. And he says, if that's the case, this is really the parsha. These two psukim, Vayhi ben Zor Haron, is its own parsha. That's what the Gemara says, because it separates between what happens earlier that in Sefer Bamidbar, where we're still acting as this people that are in the state of Tiferes, and right afterwards we start to transition to a people who are not able to do that anymore, and who really need to move into a situation of Eretz Yisrael where it's more al pi teva. And that's the separation of these two psukim. And therefore, really, Sefer Bamidbar becomes two separate svarim. The one before it is really its own sefer. And also afterwards, all of what happens after, as we start to move into the Meraglim, and then we move into Parshas Balak and Bilam, and Parshas Pinchas, and then Chukas, all of that is the second half, or its own sefer as well, as we are transitioning now into moving into Eretz Yisrael. Sefer b'fnei atzmo, k'mo shekasavti b'Parshas Bereishis al pasach zeh sefer shesipur inin gadol nikra sefer. Because when it says in Parshas Bereishis, as sipur, when we're telling over something, a major event, something that's really formative, especially to Am Yisrael, that is called a sefer. And so Sefer Bamidbar is really two svarim, and the two enumerations, I guess, are what indicate that that's what's going on. So that's how the Netziv understands Sefer Bamidbar.
Yeah, just one quick question that is making a lot of challenge in my head. Is the Netziv saying that we started, Am Yisrael started to go into this decline because the Shekhinah removed a little bit from the day-to-day life? Or is your opposite? It's saying that the Shekhinah moved away because we started to go on the wrong path.
I think that's a good question. I think what he's trying to say is that living the life of the Midbar was difficult for many people. Clearly not for Moshe Rabbeinu and others, but probably for the average person in the Midbar, it was difficult. It was difficult having that much hashgacha, where you do something wrong and right away it's the onish comes. It's a very difficult existence, I think, for them, and so I think it was just more of just pointing out that the Midbar was not. It's also, I think, the Midbar was not meant to. That's not what we were meant to, that was a very short period of time, that we are in there for. And it was really somewhat artificial. And this is really the movement of us, or the transition that we need to go into Eretz Yisrael and not be in the midbar. Right? So I don't know that it's anything that certainly we did things wrong, and there's no question about that. The way that the whole way that the Meraglim was handled, and when the Meraglim came back, right, clearly Bnei Israel didn't react well to the Meraglim. But I don't know that that's really I think what he's really getting to is the fact that we were changing and the situation was changing. And that's what Sefer Bamidbar is really split into two, sort of showing that as we were getting closer to going into Eretz Yisrael and we were ready for that, our whole relationship with Hashem changes. And we can see that clearly, even in our leadership, where Moshe Rabbeinu was no longer creating all the miracles, right? The wars at the end with Sichon and Og, those are not miraculous. They're war, and clearly we had Hashem's help, right? I mean, we have Hashgacha Pratis, even when it's not miraculous, or even when it's not revealed in a miraculous way, but that's where we were starting to change into is that. So I think that's what he's trying to.
So why don't we start on Cheta Egel? Why don't we start this transition from Cheta Egel? Why do we start until now?
Good question. So it seems like, and I don't know. You're asking good questions, and I don't know that I have the good answers. It seems like Cheta Egel isn't transformative for us. It seems like, whereas Meraglim were, and when we look at those who are the Perushim on Cheta Meraglim, it seems like Cheta Egel certainly it's built upon that. The fact that there was Cheta Egel and then Cheta Meraglim becomes this sort of straw that breaks the camel's back. But we didn't have that with Cheta Egel, where right after Cheta Egel, Hashem doesn't say, that's it, you're not going into Eretz Yisrael, right? That onus doesn't happen at that point. So
no, he wanted to destroy them, though. He said, I'll destroy all of them and start a new nation with you, Moshe.
So I guess the question I would ask back, and I don't have I don't feel like I've got great answers. I think the questions might be better than the answers, but I guess I would ask back, was that truly a possibility, or was that a test for Moshe Rabbeinu as a leader at that time? Right? What was Hashem just testing Moshe to say, are you going to stand up for them? Right? Are you going to do what he actually does? Right? That's what he does. He stands up for us, and he says, and he defends us. Was that really just a test, or would Hashem really have destroyed us? I don't know, but possibly that may have just been a test for Moshe Rabbeinu and his leadership. I mean, his first big challenge, right? That was his first major challenge of Am Yisrael as a leader in the Midbar, and that might have just been more of his own, transitioning into what does leadership mean, especially for Bnei Israel, where you're constantly having to defend us and constantly, we see, I think in generations later, where we've had leaders who are really like that, who learn from Moshe Rabbeinu and stand up for us even when our actions may not have been the best.
Well, Jeff, there's already a Parsha Pekude. Is there a count in that Parsha too? Or is the word in Pekude different meaning?
No, that's a great question. So in Pekude, that's usually connected with Vayakel at the end of Shemos. They are counting, right? They're counting up everything that was donated for the Mishkan. And that's where, they actually have to say, stop, right? No more gifts, no more charity, no more for the Mishkan. We have enough. But that's actually where they count up. What did they actually receive in terms of gold, silver, copper, everything else, all the other materials that they received. So yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a similar use of the word, but we're counting material as opposed to Bnei Israel in that parsha.
But when Uri asked you about the meaning of the word, there's also Hashem Pakada Sarah. It's the same, and it's a totally different
absolutely
meaning.
Absolutely. And then you also have we talked about earlier, is like in modern Hebrew, the mifaked, right? The person who's in charge, who's the boss, the whatever whatever you want to translate that as, right? That word can have different meanings. for sure. Yep. In this sense, then we see that, like I said, if you go through Parshas Bamidbar with Unclus, you'll see where he translates it differently. Most of the time he's using it to count, but sometimes he's also talking about how it's appointing, because you're appointing the leadership as well in that parsha. And it's sometimes confusing. What does it mean in this pasuk versus what does it mean in the other pasuk?
Very good. Yasher koach.
Baruch Tia, great questions. So hopefully this is again just another insight into Sefer Bamidbar, and we should have to take a look at these psukim as we go through Baloscha and the further parshios. All right, everyone should have a good rest of their week.